And thank you for that introduction. It's really fantastic to be with everybody today. And so I will get right into it. Again, everyone, thank you for joining. You know, as Jeffrey said, you know, the topic of today's presentation is leading in challenging times. Certainly today, with everything that's going on in our country, in the world, I think everyone would agree that we are in challenging times. Now you'll see the topic I have on my first presentation slide here is leadership, it takes a team. And the reason I have that phrase up there is because I think as you lead in challenging times, you certainly cannot go it alone, at least if you're going to be successful. You have to lead as a team for sure, and you have to develop a strong team around you. And that's what we're going to be talking a little bit about today. By the way, I encourage everybody to please take some notes. The other thing is, you know, as I go through this presentation, please enter any questions into the chat room as you think of those questions. And we're going to have a little bit of time at the end of the presentation. Jeffrey, as the moderator, is going to look at those questions, and I'll field some of those questions that Jeffrey asks me as they come from you all. So don't wait until the end of the presentation to put a question in. Please put those questions in right away. And then I'm going to do my best to make this as interactive as possible. We'll see how that goes, but certainly at least through the chat, we'll have some interaction there. You know, I like to tell stories, and I'm going to pepper this presentation with stories throughout. And the first story I'm going to tell is really just quickly about myself. As Jeffrey mentioned, I spent 40 years in the Army. You know, I got my commission as a second lieutenant in 1978, and then I retired from the Army last year in 2019, in June 2019, as a major general. And certainly never thought I was going to spend 40 years in the Army, never thought I was going to retire at the rank of major general. But of those 40 years, 12 of those years were spent on active duty. The other 28 years were spent in the Pennsylvania Army National Guard. And the reason why that's significant is because, you know, being a traditional guardsman in the National Guard meant that I also had to have a full-time civilian job. And so for 15 years, I was a part owner of a service and retail company in northeastern Pennsylvania. And I gained a lot of, along with the leadership experience I gained in the military, I gained a lot of leadership experience in that particular civilian endeavor. And then after that, I worked for a management consulting firm in the Philadelphia region. We did management consulting, executive coaching, leadership consulting for many Fortune 500 companies throughout the United States, primarily in the utility industry, telecommunications industry, and in healthcare. So along with the lessons and the experience on leadership I've gained in the military, I've also been able to gain many leadership lessons in the civilian sector as well. And I think for the folks that we have joining us today, some of you may have military experience, many of you may not, but it's going to be relevant to all of you, no matter what type of organization you lead or what type of organization you're part of. So when you look at the last part of my career where I was actually a senior leader, and I say a senior leader, you know, colonel, brigadier general, and then major general, I led a variety of teams. When in the year 2000, when I was a colonel, I was actually assigned over to the country of Lithuania for a year. And in Lithuania, again, a Baltic country, former Soviet republic, I worked with a team of 9, which included both American military and Lithuanians on that team. So that was an interesting challenge, leading just that small team of 9. And then in Ramadi, Iraq, in 2005 and 2006, I commanded a brigade. The brigade consisted of over 5,000 United States soldiers in the Army and also Marines. And then along with that, I had almost 5,000 Iraqi soldiers reporting directly to me and working for me. And then after that, between 2012 and 2016, I led 15,000 soldiers as the commanding general of the 28th Infantry Division. and then finished off my career as a deputy commanding general at U.S. Army Europe, where between assigned and rotational forces over there, we had over 35,000 soldiers within the U.S. Army Europe command structure there. So I like to ask this question, who is on your team? And I'd like you to think about that. And as you're taking notes, and it's like, as I go through the presentation, get the opportunity, put your position in whatever position you're at your organization, and also just give us an idea of who you think is on your team. And we hopefully at the end, we'll have a little bit of opportunity to kind of dissect that a little bit. When I commanded the 28th Infantry Division between 2012 and 2016, and I did that on a full-time basis, I had an opportunity to go to a commemoration for Vietnam War veterans. And it was a ceremony in South Central Pennsylvania. And as I was at that venue, I was walking around talking to some of the Vietnam vets, and I came across this individual who you see here. His name is Chow Lee, and he was wearing a U.S. Army dress uniform. And I went up to him and I said, "Hey, are you a Vietnam War veteran?" And he said, "Well, yes, I am, but I did not fight in the U.S. Army." I said, "Oh, tell me a little bit more about that." He said, "I fought in the South Vietnamese Army, but I fought alongside U.S. soldiers." And then he went on to tell me the rest of his story, because again, he was wearing a U.S. Army uniform. And he told me he actually ended up retiring from the U.S. Army. So he told me that he was in Saigon on April 30th, 1975, as the North Vietnamese troops were moving into Saigon and the U.S. Embassy in Saigon was falling. And since he was a South Vietnamese soldier and he worked very closely with the U.S. military, he knew that he had the best chance of survival if he left Saigon and Vietnam. He felt that if the North Vietnamese soldiers detained him, he would either be tortured or put to death. The other thing is, since he worked a great deal with the U.S. military, he learned about American values. And he saw the United States of America as a beacon of liberty. He did not want to live under a communist regime. He wanted to live in a free society. And that was his other goal, to not only leave South Vietnam, but also to make his way to the United States. So he was a UH-1 helicopter pilot, known as the Huey helicopter. And here was April 30th, the North Vietnamese forces were entering the city. He got into a Huey helicopter and he cranked up that engine. And as he was cranking up the engine, it drew other people to that helicopter that also wanted to leave Saigon. And by the time he got that engine cranked up to the point where he could take off, he had 25 people clinging to that helicopter, a helicopter that usually carries 12 combat troops. He had 25 people clinging to that helicopter. And he managed to get it up off the ground, it lifted off, and then he started to fly east over the South China Sea. He had no route established for his flight. He had no flight plan established. He just knew he had to get out of there. And he was flying over the open water, the South China Sea, glancing down at it, seeing nothing but water underneath him. And he picked up the handset on the radio and he started to talk over the radio. And what he said was, "Mayday, Mayday, this is the flight of freedom. Mayday, Mayday, this is the flight of freedom." He was hoping somebody would hear him because he had no idea where he was going to go to. Then he glanced down at his fuel tank. It had less than a quarter tank of fuel in that helicopter. Finally, he heard a voice on the other end of that radio. It was the USS Midway conducting operations in the northern part of the South China Sea. And they vectored him in. He was able to fly his helicopter over to the USS Midway, and the crew talked him down into landing on the deck of that aircraft carrier. And Chow Lee told me that when he climbed out of that cockpit, he wanted to hug every crew member on that ship. And so from that ship, he was sent to a refugee camp in the country of Austria. And while in Austria, he never let that dream of his die that he wanted to get to the United States. So the personnel of that refugee camp were able to fill out some paperwork. He was actually able to be transferred to the United States. He went to a refugee camp in Arizona, and he stayed in that refugee camp for a bit, and then he was transferred to a refugee camp at Fort Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania, in south central Pennsylvania, not too far from Harrisburg. From that refugee camp, he was actually finally left that camp, decided to live in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is right in the area. And then he joined the Pennsylvania Army National Guard, got requalified as a Huey helicopter pilot, and ended up spending over 20 years flying helicopters in the Pennsylvania Army National Guard before he ended up retiring as a Chief Warrant Officer 3. I think that's a remarkable story. A remarkable story for a few different reasons. Some of the things I'm going to be talking about today. First of all, decision making. He had to make a decision, a life and death decision that may not have turned out so well, but he had the courage to make that decision. He had to display resiliency. He had to overcome that adverse situation that he was in, and he certainly did that. And then he had to display character. You know, when those 20 people were clinging to that helicopter, he didn't kick them off. He allowed them to stay on the helicopter and was able to transport them to freedom as well. And then one would think, after I tell the story, that, hey, he was just a lone wolf. He did everything on his own. But talking to Chow Lee, as I did, he will tell you that nothing could be further from the truth. He went on to tell me that it took a team to get him, back here to the United States. He said, first of all, the maintenance team that had to work on that helicopter that allowed him to take off with double the passenger load, over double the passenger load on it. And then the fact that the USS Midway crew were able to vector him in and then help him land on that aircraft carrier. He appreciated that team that allowed him to land on the USS Midway. Then when he got to Austria, the team there at the refugee camp that took care of his life support issues, and that also was able to fill out paperwork and get him to the United States. And then finally, he joined the Pennsylvania Army National Guard and joined a team of teams in the 28th Infantry Division, Pennsylvania National Guard. So he will be the first to tell you that it took a team. It wasn't just something he accomplished all by himself. This is a shot of a particular street corner in Ramadi, Iraq. And again, I commanded a brigade there in 2005, 2006, as Jeffrey mentioned. It was known as the most violent place on the face of the earth at that time. It was a National Guard brigade, but I also had active duty forces task organized in my brigade. As I think back, on past periods in my life, the two most defining periods I could think of, one was when I did take that cross-country bicycle trip with my wife and 15-month-old son back in 1983, where we bicycled from Washington State to Pennsylvania, all self-contained. So that was a defining 3-month period in my life. And the other defining period in my life is when I commanded this brigade of over 5,000 soldiers and Marines in Ramadi, Iraq in 2005 and 2006. Now, this brigade was made up of National Guard units from over 35 states. I mean, imagine that. And then I also had 3 different active duty Marine infantry battalions task organized to my brigade over the 1-year time. We conducted operations there, and I had 2 different active duty Army brigades or Army battalions task organized to my brigade. Now, as I mentioned, a brigade is around 5,000 soldiers. A battalion is generally somewhere around 800 soldiers, just to kind of put that into perspective for people. But this was a typical scene in Ramadi. As a matter of fact, it was a very, very violent place, as I mentioned. Sadly and unfortunately, I had 82 of my soldiers and Marines killed in action there. I had another 260 that were wounded seriously enough where they had to be evacuated back to the United States. The insurgent activity was very high. Their weapon of choice was the roadside bomb. And they also had other weapons that they used, sniper fire, small arms fire, mortar, rockets, all those type of attacks. So again, it was a very, very violent time. The reason I paint that picture is, again, just because the topic here, leading in challenging times, and that certainly was challenging. Now, as you saw on the previous slide, 3 of the things I'm going to be talking about, if I could back up here a second, are decision-making, resiliency, and character. And the first thing I'm going to be talking about is decision-making. And you'll see 3 gentlemen on the screen there in front of you. See Jack Welch, Harry Truman, and Colin Powell. And you may be thinking to yourself, what do these 3 gentlemen have in common? Well, they've all had very specific thoughts on decision-making. Jack Welch, when he was the CEO of General Electric between 1981 and 2001, he wrote that one thing he observed is that mid-level managers really struggled with having the courage to make decisions. And he saw that as a deficit, and that's one thing he tried to inculcate into the training at General Electric, was decision-making. Harry Truman, obviously, if you look back at history, he had many hard decisions to make. The first decision that comes to my mind is dropping the atomic bomb on Japan to end World War II. Another decision he made was integrating the military. He made that decision in 1948, 17 years before the Civil Rights Act was passed. So he was very much forward-leaning for that type of issue, which I thank him for. And then he also made the decision to have the United States enter the Korean War. Now, he said that, of course, as a leader makes a decision, the best possible decision is the right decision, however you define the right decision to be. And he said, of course, sometimes leaders are going to make the wrong decision. But he went on to say, in his opinion, making the wrong decision was much better than making no decision at all. And think about that as leaders yourself. Think about leaders you've worked for who really struggled with making decisions. Think about leaders you may have worked for who really just decided not to make decisions time and time after again. And think of how that makes followers feel when leaders just don't make decisions. I think it leads to frustration. I think it leads to uncertainty. I think it leads to a lack of trust in an organization if you have a leader with the propensity who just kind of gives a Heisman to decisions that they have to make and just plain doesn't make decisions. So making decisions is extremely important to build trust and create an environment of certainty in an organization. And then Colin Powell, he went on to say that leaders have to be able to make decisions with well less than perfect information. He actually wrote that leaders have to be able to make a decision with only a 40 to 70% chance of making the right decision. But again, it comes down to courage, the courage of making those type of decisions. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the decisions I had to make in Ramadi, Iraq. And I'll just say that September 19th, 2005 was a very bad day for me, for my brigade. The reason it was a bad day is September 19, 2005, we had 4 of our soldiers killed in action that day. 1 in the morning with a roadside bomb, and then 3 others later on that afternoon. Again, another roadside bomb attack. And then September 28th, 2005 was a bad day. That was a day where we had a patrol out in southern Ramadi. We had soldiers riding in a Bradley fighting vehicle, which is an armored track vehicle. You would think it's very, very protective. A large roadside bomb, subsurface roadside bomb, detonated right underneath that Bradley fighting vehicle and killed 5 of our soldiers instantly. So again, within a week, we had 9 of our soldiers killed all from the same battalion. And I mentioned a battalion usually has about 800 soldiers in it. Because these soldiers were all killed in action from that same battalion, that battalion was really kind of set back on its heels a bit. The battalion commander, he was really just beside himself with the fact that they took these casualties. The morale in the battalion actually dipped because of these casualties that they were taking. They were figuring like every day is like Groundhog Day. These attacks don't stop. I had to make a decision because we were only about 3 months into our 1-year deployment there. I could not have this battalion, which was a key battalion of ours, getting low morale and feeling frustrated that early into that deployment. So I got with the battalion commander and I got with some other leaders and I asked their opinions about, hey, what do you think we should do? We've got to do something. Got their opinions, we talked about it, and then I made a decision. I decided that the best thing for that battalion to do, not necessarily for tactical reasons, but more for morale reasons, more for mental reasons, that they had to do something that was considered to be an offensive type of operation. And so what we did in that area of Ramadi where these soldiers were killed is I got with the battalion, I ordered them to do a cordon and search operation there. It took almost all 800 soldiers of that battalion to do that operation, which was very unusual because when fighting a counterinsurgency, you usually want to do things at the platoon level, which is at around a 44 soldier level. But I wanted all of his 800 soldiers engaged so they felt like they were doing something, like they were making a difference, they were being proactive. So they did this a large cordon outside of the area, a little bit smaller cordon inside the area, did a search of various houses that we had targeted information on. They were able to detain some high value detainees that day, which we were able to get some good intelligence from, and also found bomb making material and other ordnance in some of these houses that we had good intelligence on. So again, just the fact that that battalion was able to do something proactive rather than just being reactive really made a difference in the morale of that particular unit. So I pass that on for your consideration as leaders to think about that. I believe you have to have an offensive mindset. The other thing in terms of making decisions, sometimes you've got to use tactical patience, and I'll give you an example. About a month after that, we had a patrol out in central Ramadi, and it was a dismounted patrol, and they were maneuvering through the city. And I was in the tactical operations center at our brigade headquarters, and I got a call on the radio from this patrol leader, and he was requesting that I have a attack helicopter fire ordnance on the roof of a building that he said he believed insurgents were on top of because he saw some weapons up there. Something just didn't seem right to me. And again, this patrol wasn't under fire at the time or anything. And he was really, asking very, very aggressively for an attack helicopter to fire on the roof of that building. But again, something just didn't seem right. So we got him to send his patrol to take a little bit closer look. And as it turned out, what he saw on top of that building was actually a civil affairs unit from the division headquarters. It wasn't part of our brigade at all. And we weren't informed that they were going to be out there conducting some operations. So again, the point of this is sometimes you've got to use tactical patience. And I think a lot of that comes with experience. A lot of that comes with a little bit of wisdom. To have the wisdom to know, when do I have to make a quick decision? Because, a lot of us are taught that decisions have to be made quickly, but not necessarily. And when could I use a little bit of tactical patience to let the situation develop a little bit more before I make that decision? The other thing I found with my work in the military and my work with civilian organizations is usually the lower level the leader is, the quicker they generally have to make a decision. I was at a quick story. I was at a plant down in the Dallas, Texas area in December doing a leadership assessment there for a large defense contractor. And at this plant, they told me a story where there was they had a lot of heavy equipment there, a lot of furnaces, just a lot of ways to get hurt. They had a situation where one of the employees was overcome with fumes, and the first line supervisor had to make a quick decision to shut the line down, and that cost the company tens of thousands of dollars to shut that line down for about 4 hours until everything was under control again and the situation was taken care of. And thank God that employee was able to survive that particular trauma that he had. But again, sometimes you got to make a quick decision, but sometimes you could use a little bit of tactical patience. Bottom line is, followers expect leaders to make decisions. And there's the phrase I have there on that slide, that leaders dispel uncertainty through action. And that's exactly what followers expect leaders to do. And leaders don't need to be great all the time, but they do need to be great when it matters. Let me just pause there for a moment and let me kind of get with Jeffrey. I know he's got control of the chat room there. And Jeffrey, I just want to take a moment here and see if there's any questions that came in or comments that came in that we may need to expand on a little bit.
Several responses to your initial inquiry, your warm-up question about who's part of your team. And one of our participants says, because I am in a job search currently, my team is my accountability group. We have 10 members. Okay. Another participant says, I too am in a job search. So my accountability group includes my wife and kids, my mother and brother, a few people from our church, and several close friends. And a third participant states that her accountability group includes her mother, friends, and members of her church. So, John, why is that accountability group so important?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I could use that from my own personal experience. I spent 2016 to 2019 over at U.S. Army Europe. And I had a large team around me, people I could count on, people who advised me. And then I retired in June 2019. I come to Lebanon, Pennsylvania, which is a rural community. And it was kind of like a culture shock. One day having a team around me, in this military organization. And the next day, I felt like I was on my own. And one thing I realized I had to do was exactly what some of these folks are saying. I had to build my own accountability team. I had to reach out to people and form a network. And I tried to make the network as diverse as I could, and but people who had similar values to me. You could have a diverse group, but I do think in many cases the values have to be relatively similar. And I found that there's certain people now that I could pick up the phone or jump on a Zoom call and kind of have a conversation with them about certain decisions that I'm mulling over in my personal life or in my business life. And it's just nice to have somebody to talk to and bounce ideas off of. So the reason it's important to have that accountability team, two main things. First of all, they could be a sounding board. They could hear you out. And sometimes just by the fact that we talk, we could kind of get a fresher perspective on things. And then the other thing, they're calling it an accountability group, which means they have some people who are going to hold them accountable. So if one of my goals is to enter a certificate program and get a certificate on executive coaching, or to enter an MBA program and finish my MBA, whatever that is, or maybe one of my goals is to lose 20 pounds. I mean, it doesn't matter. You've got that accountability group that now can kind of hold your feet to the fire and keep you accountable rather than you just being out there on your own. Which sometimes it's easy to kind of let things slide a little bit. So Jeffrey, that would be my answer to that.
Yes, and as it relates to 40 plus and our job skills transition course, we have what we call a job club, so that at the end of the 4-week, 43-hour course, our participants move from being classmates to a job club where they help each other and make each other accountable in their respective job search. And over time, they transition from a job club where they're seeking employment to a success club where our participants have found employment and they come together to share their experiences with their new employment. And again, that sense of accountability to know that we're all in this together. So
Yeah, no, that's
there's a
all.
parallel.
Yeah, no, that's great. And everybody has to build a network, and some, if you have a full-time job with a staff around you, you kind of have a built-in network. But even with that, I think you got to reach out a little bit outside of that work team. So no, that's great stuff. Jeffrey, anything else there that you want to cover right now before I move on?
Well, you spoke about decision-making, resiliency, and character. Um, Looking at resiliency in your life, growing up in Pennsylvania, taking this months-long trip cross country by way of cycling with your wife and new child, your work, over 40 years in the military. Give us your perspective on resiliency as it relates to life and living and the parallel to a job search.
Okay, that tees up what I'm going to say next very, very well. And then after this, I'll pause again. But yeah, I have done a lot of thinking and studying and praying, if you will, about resiliency. And to me, resiliency is about overcoming adversity. And, I heard somebody talking about resiliency a while back, and I thought it was very interesting because a lot of times somebody will define resiliency as bouncing back. And bouncing back kind of implies that, you're going to find a difficult situation, you're going to overcome that situation, then you're going to come back to the state you had been in. But I think a better way to think of that is you're going to transform. Whenever you encounter a situation which is adverse that you've got to overcome, you're probably going to change in some way. You're probably not going to bounce back to what you had been before. So I think it's more of a transformational process. And I like to say resiliency is really about three things that you can see there on the slide. The first one is positive energy. So resiliency isn't only about, hey, I have a difficult situation, now I got to overcome it. Resiliency is also about being positive, to be successful and have some hope and have some optimism. I think we've all been around people that I like to frame as an energy sponge. And that's people where, we encounter them and they just have a way of drawing energy out of us because they're always so negative. They're always so down about stuff. And they kind of draw energy from everybody in the room. And, they're the kind of person who could brighten up a room by leaving it. You don't want to be that kind of person. You want to have some positive energy. You want to be optimistic. Again, going back to Colin Powell again, who I talked about earlier. Colin Powell has a famous quote that says, optimism is a force multiplier. And again, you just want to exude this positive energy. Now, that doesn't mean that you look through rose-colored glasses. You have to be pragmatic about the situations at hand. But as a leader, you've got to make that team believe that, okay, we've got an adverse situation here, but we're going to overcome it because we're going to do this as a team. We're going to do it together. I'm optimistic we're going to succeed. And you have to exude that positive energy. The second thing I like to say is fitness. Now, yes, I'm talking about physical fitness. I think physical fitness is important, but I'm talking about other elements of fitness too. I'm talking about mental fitness, emotional fitness, spiritual fitness. And just as we might go out on a bicycle ride or go out for a walk or go out for a run or lift weights or whatever we're going to do to help ourselves get physically fit, we've got to take the time to be fit in those other areas. And I'll give you just a couple of quick examples. Emotional fitness. Daniel Goleman wrote many books on emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence has several different components to it. It's about having the ability to be self-aware. And once you're aware of your emotions, then having the ability to control those emotions. It's having the ability to self-motivate yourself to move from a negative emotion to a more positive emotion. Because let's face it, we all have challenges in our life. We all have disappointments in our life, and it could get us down. So we've got to have the motivation to move us from a negative feeling to a positive feeling. And those are internal elements of emotional intelligence. And many people say you have to be successful at achieving those three internal elements before you could get into the other external elements. One of the external elements is empathy. As a leader, we need to be empathetic. We need to be able to read people. We need to be able to understand how people are feeling. And I would argue that you can't be empathetic if you are not a self-aware person. If you're not aware of your own emotions, how are you going to be aware of somebody else's emotions? And so that's why I say those internal elements have to be, you have to be trained on those first. And then the last element of emotional intelligence is relationship management. And that's where, building a network, getting people around you who could help you out and doing those type of things to manage relationships successfully. So those are elements of emotional intelligence that we could all work on. Now, how do you work on them? You get some of Goleman's books, you could do a little bit of research on the internet, but you have to think about it and read about it and then actually practice becoming stronger in emotional intelligence. And anybody could do it. It just takes a little bit of training. It takes a little bit of time. And then spiritual fitness. Now, this could or doesn't have to have anything to do with an organized religion. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. It could be, going out for a walk in the morning and having it be a meditative walk. It could be just having mindfulness, just taking the time to sit down in a quiet place every day and just kind of think about what's going on in your life. So that spiritual fitness is also very, very important, however anybody wants to define that. But I really think it comes down to just understanding that there's something out there greater than ourselves. And then the last thing I have down there is vulnerability. And people, when I talk about vulnerability as it applies to leadership, some people start scratching their head a little bit like, what do you mean about vulnerability? Well, I mean several different things. First of all, in order to train yourself to be able to overcome adversity, because overcoming adversity just isn't going to happen on its own, you got to train for it. You've got to take opportunities to place yourself outside of your comfort zone, to challenge yourself in certain ways. It could be physically, it could be mentally, it doesn't matter, but you've got to take those opportunities to go out of your comfort zone. The other thing is you have to put yourself out there. You have to let people know what your principles are. You have to let people know what you believe in. And, you're going to get some criticism whenever you put yourself out there, but you have to allow yourself to be vulnerable as a leader if you're going to be successful. The other thing I like to talk about is allow yourself to be vulnerable to the people you lead by going out there, talking to the folks you lead, and maybe, telling them some stories, about things that happened in your life. A lot of times as leaders, our followers think because we're at a high level of leadership or whatever level of leadership that we're at, some of our followers think, oh man, that person probably, everything they touch turns to gold. They probably never made a mistake in their life or they wouldn't have gotten to that leadership position. Well, any of us know as leaders that nothing could be farther from the truth. So share stories with your followers about mistakes you made, about the time you swung the bat and you missed, about a time that you failed, because I've learned the most during times when I've made mistakes and during times when I've failed at something. I learn a lot more when I fail than when I succeed. So share those stories with your followers so they know you're not a robot. They know you have emotions. And if they have a problem, they're going to be probably more likely to bring it to you in that case. And then the other thing you have to do in terms of vulnerability is ask people what their opinion is. You know, as a leader, you don't necessarily have to be the smartest person on all issues. And I think showing people that you respect them is very, very important. And there's several ways you can show people that you respect them. One way is treat them with dignity. Even when they screw up and you have to correct them, treat them with dignity. The other thing is respect people's time. You know, if you call a meeting as a leader that's supposed to start at 11 o'clock in the morning, don't walk in at 11:10. Be on time for the meetings you call. Show people you respect their time. And then the third thing is respect people's opinions. And the way you do that is by asking your followers from time to time when the situation is appropriate, what is your opinion? It doesn't mean you have to follow their recommendation, but I think they're going to appreciate you asking their opinion. And if you go with a different course of action and don't follow their recommendation, I think a great technique for a leader is to follow up with that person and let them know that, hey, we're going to take a different path, not necessarily the path that you recommended, but this is the reason why. Whenever you have the time to do that, I think it's a great leadership technique. So with that, Jeffrey, I'm going to pause again to try to make this as interactive as we could and see if anyone has a question or comment there. And I do want to remind everybody who's on the call today, don't wait until the end of the presentation to ask your questions. Please type those questions in as we go. So Jeffrey, anything?
Well, let's focus in for a moment here on character. And before we do so, again, feel free, participants, ladies and gentlemen, to ask questions and to make comments. Okay. Character is certainly important, and we build character over time throughout our lives by way of trial and error and that whole idea of resilience. Tell us, how this focus on character helped you to be successful through your military career. And
Absolutely will. And by the way, I had character listed as the last topic I was going to talk about today, but I believe character is foundational to being an effective leader. If you don't have that character, I don't think you're going to be able to lead effectively at all. And, you know, a lot of times we talk about servant leadership, serving others, you know, putting the welfare of your followers before your own welfare. That is easy to say, but in practical terms, very, very hard to do. I think the only people who could naturally put somebody else's welfare ahead of their own is a parent. A parent. I think a parent could naturally put the welfare of their children before their own welfare. I think any one of us would jump in front of a bus to save one of our children. So that comes naturally if you're a parent. It's something you have to do as a leader, but it doesn't come quite so naturally. So you've got to work at that. But again, getting back to servant leadership, I've had people ask me, what's so important about servant leadership? Why do you have to put your followers' welfare first? You know, what is that all about? Well, I like to say you could lead like a tyrant. You could lead like a tyrant, and you're probably going to have a win, or maybe you'll have 2 wins, but you're not going to have long-term success. To have long-term success, you have to lead like a servant leader. You know, I had a friend of mine who wrote a book, and in the course of writing that book, he interviewed Coach Krzyzewski, the coach of Duke University, known as Coach K. And Coach K happens to be a West Point graduate. I believe he played basketball for West Point, but again, everybody knows him, I think, as the coach of Duke University. And during the course of the interview, Coach K was asked, what does character have to do with winning a basketball game? And Coach K answered this way. He said, good character has absolutely nothing at all to do with winning a basketball game. But it has everything to do with winning a championship. And I think that's the difference between leading like a tyrant and leading like a servant leader. If you want to have long-term success, you've got to develop those servant leader characteristics. And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit now with this slide. And you'll see I have character listed. Again, I believe that's the foundational element to being an effective, successful leader, and values.
Hey, John, we have several questions here.
Okay, let's go for the questions then.
Okay, so John, how do you get emotionally fit?
Yeah, I think those elements of emotional fitness. So self-awareness. How do I get self-aware? I think using your accountability team could help you become more self-aware. You know, actually, Jeffrey, after this meeting we're going to have here today, or this presentation, I do plan on getting with you on the phone or on a Zoom call and getting some feedback from you. So just if you find yourself in a situation, maybe it's a confrontational situation where maybe you lose your cool a little bit. You know, if there's somebody in your network around while that happens, it's nice to be able to get them on the side afterward and maybe get a little bit of feedback from them. So that's one way you could develop self-awareness. Another way to develop self-control is you have to be conscious of it. A big part of self-control is pausing. A big part of self-control, believe it or not, is taking a sip of water. If you find yourself losing control, if you have a glass of water, a cup of coffee, a water bottle full of water, take a little bit of a drink. That's going to allow you to take a breath. It's going to allow you to calm down a little bit. As a matter of fact, it's a good technique you could use when let's say you're counseling a worker of yours and the meeting gets a little bit confrontational. It's nice to have a bottle of water in your office and hand the bottle of water to the person and say, hey, take a drink. Don't try to do that in a condescending way, but it usually calms people down. So you could work on self-awareness, you could work on self-control, self-motivation. Again, you could use your accountability team to help you get from a negative emotion you might have to a more positive emotion. Empathy. I really think it takes a little bit of having some coaches around you to help you with that, Jeffrey. That would be my answer.
That's a good point. Your comments remind me of the start of Rudyard Kipling's poem, If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself when no man trusts you, but make allowance for their doubting too. Good point. Yeah. Okay, next question. Can you talk about some of your role models for leadership?
Yeah. If you look back at historical examples, I like to think of Abraham Lincoln as a good role model personally. He certainly had to lead through adverse times. He had a goal to keep the Union together. He had specific ideas about slavery. So he's one of my role models. In modern times, one of the commanding generals at U.S. Army Europe that I worked for, both were excellent, by the way. I worked for two different commanding generals, one for 18 months, and then the second one for another 18 months since I was there for 3 years. But General Ben Hodges, he was a team builder. He was a great communicator. He was able to communicate very well. Another role model, another general officer, General Craig, who was a division commander before I was, a very spiritual man. I've learned the importance of spirituality from him. A sergeant that served in Iraq with me and then ended up losing a leg in Afghanistan 3 years after he served in Iraq with me. Earl Granville, who had his leg amputated after a roadside bomb blast in Afghanistan and was lying in a bed. And the doctor came in and said, you're not going to ever be able to run again, but it's not because of the leg we took off, it's because of the leg you have. You have to make a decision whether you want me to amputate your other leg or not, if you want to run. So here he was, a young man in his 20s who had to make the decision whether to have his second leg taken off. A tough decision. He came back to his home in Pennsylvania after that. And shortly after returning home, his twin brother committed suicide. And Earl, instead of losing it, he's dedicated his life to helping other people, military or otherwise, be able to work their way through very, very tough situations. So he's a role model for me. So those are some of my role models.
The questions are coming in. John, most of us are actively searching for jobs and are frequently asked about leading others, although we may not have had direct reports. How best can we explain our leadership capabilities without the benefit of overseeing a staff?
Yeah, I think the first thing you have to do is first of all, define what your core values are. A lot of people haven't taken the time to really define what are your core values. I've done that. I know exactly what my 5 core values are. And then you have to determine what your leadership philosophy is. And determining what your core values are and determining what your leadership philosophy isn't done in 30 minutes or 60 minutes. It's something you've got to think long and hard about over months, write it down, define it, and live by those things. My personal leadership philosophy is character, competence, and resilience. And then there's several components of each one of those 3. I believe in trying to keep things simple, keep it to 3s. But if during an interview, if somebody asks you, what your leadership philosophy is, if you just hem and haw and struggle a little bit, it would be evident to me as an interviewer that you probably really don't have a leadership philosophy. So I think that's the best thing you could do is think long and hard about those things, write them down, define them, and then do your best to live them. Because even if you don't have a staff around you, everybody leads something. If you don't lead a team at work, you lead your family. If you don't have a family, you lead yourself. You might belong to an organization where you're a leader. Everybody leads something. So you have to take advantage of that. And then also keep track of the different things you've led. And then during the course of the interview, you could point out exactly what your leadership experience was and what you achieved.
Okay. All right. This participant asks, do you have books to recommend that you found particularly meaningful? These could be on leadership as well as other topics.
Yeah. The Leadership Engine by Noel Tichy, Tichy, Noel, Noel, was a book I read many years ago. I'm sure you can still find it on Amazon, probably find it as a used book. But he gets into what he called a leader's teachable point of view, which is about telling stories and having a moral to those stories, based on your own personal life or the life of others. That's a good one. A book I recently read by Jocko Willink, who's a retired Navy SEAL, is Extreme Ownership. That's a good leadership book. You can learn a lot from history. You can learn a lot of leadership examples from history. I mean, and it's not just about leading in the military. You can apply these examples to civilian life easily. There's a book by retired 3-star General Hal Moore called We Were Soldiers Once and Young, which is his experience as a battalion commander in the Vietnam War. So just off the top of my head, those are some books that I would certainly recommend.
All righty. You said earlier, this participant states that a bad decision is better than no decision. You also talked about resilience. What's the best response when you as a leader make a bad decision that hurts the team?
Yeah, I think, first of all, when you make a decision, I think you have to stay attentive to the situation and be ready to pivot and adjust a little bit. I think it's a mistake as a leader to make a decision and then just be wedded to that decision no matter what. I'm reading a book about Gettysburg right now, 1863, July 1st through July 3rd, and how Robert E. Lee seemed to be very, very just wedded to that decision about, hey, we're in Pennsylvania, we're going to continue to attack. So I think as a leader, once you make a decision, you have to be attentive, observe what is happening and be prepared to pivot or adjust a little bit. You shouldn't have your ego tied with that decision to the point where you're not willing to adjust. So I think that's one of the main keys there. And what was the second part of that question on resiliency?
Let's see. Said, what's the best response when you, as a leader, make a bad decision that hurts the team?
Absolutely. I think the best response is to own up to it, not blame anybody else. I made a bad decision in Iraq. Between January 3rd, 2006 and January 5th, 2006, we were doing this recruiting event at the glass factory there where we were having great success for the first time in the 6 months we had been there, bringing Iraqi citizens in to join the Iraqi police. That was a turning point for us. My big mistake is I did it 3 days in a row. When you're fighting a counterinsurgency, you never want to do something 3 days in a row, but we were having so much success. I got a little bit arrogant with the success we were having. I did it for a third day in a row, and a suicide bomber detonated their vest and killed one of my best friends, Mike McLaughlin, and killed a Marine dog handler, Sergeant Can, and killed about 100 Iraqi civilians. It was devastating. And the next day I got everybody together. I said, we're going to have an after action review. We're going to have a lessons learned about this event. I said, before anybody says anything, this was my responsibility. So we don't have to waste time figuring out who to blame for this devastating attack. It was my responsibility. Let's figure out how to fix this for the next time. So the best way to handle a bad decision is take it on, own it, and don't fix blame on anybody else. But take the time to do a lessons learned and try to get everybody to learn a little bit from that.
All right. And one more question before you go on with your talk, and that is, can you provide an example of your most challenging time where resilience was a struggle and how you affected, how you were affected in terms of change, transition, or influence?
Yeah, I think that's an easy answer for me. The most challenging time was commanding that brigade in Ramadi for a year. I did everything one would advise me not to do. In other words, we were authorized to take 2 weeks leave and come back to the United States. I never did that. I just stayed there the whole time. We were advised to do some physical training every day. I didn't do that. It ended up where I was eating like 1 meal a day. And I'm not saying that was the right thing to do. I'm just saying it was a violent situation there and there was a lot going on, and I felt that's what I needed to do. But that was a tough situation. And I'll tell you, and this goes back to my point on resiliency, about resiliency doesn't happen by itself. You've got to train yourself to be resilient. If I wasn't in excellent physical condition before I got there, if I wasn't a generally positive person before I got there, if I wasn't a generally optimistic person before I got there, it could have been a lot worse for me. So you've got to train yourself to be positive. You've got to train yourself to be fit. You've got to train yourself to find ways to take yourself out of your comfort zone in order to harden yourself a bit. So that'd be my answer to that most difficult time in my life.
Okay. All right. There's actually one more question. Could you give your opinion on how negative or abrasive leaders, as in loud and wrong, can have a long-term impact on you as a leader?
Yeah, I've had 2 different leaders like that. And what I did is I learned from that. I learned not to be that way. And you are exactly right. They'll pound you down. They'll make life miserable. And you have to be resilient to overcome that. The best way as a leader, I found, though, is, if I'm leading an organization and the leader above me is abrasive and toxic, I have to try to shield the people who work for me from that abrasive leader. I've got to be able to deflect that toxicity away from the team that works for me. And that's just something you have to do. You have to, suck it up and deflect any of that negativity away from your team.
Excellent, excellent response. Major General, the floor is yours, sir.
Okay, getting into character here. This is really the last major topic I wanted to talk about here. And I want to start out with a little story. I already talked about the importance of values, I think, in some of the questions. Having character and displaying integrity will certainly build trust in an organization. I think there's several ways to build trust. Let me talk about that right now before I tell this little story. I think there's 5 primary ways I found to grow trust in an organization. I don't think trust is built. I think trust is grown. Because when you grow something, that implies that it takes time. When you build something, yeah, sometimes building something takes time, but you could sometimes build things quicker than you could grow something. And growing takes nurturing. Growing takes cultivating. And in order to have trust in an organization, you've got to do those things. But number 1, you got to trust others first. So if I'm coming into an organization and I don't really know the people who are working for me, I still have to trust them first. And I put it to you this way. Who's ever worked for somebody who didn't trust you? Again, kind of, I'm not expecting anybody to raise their hand here or anything, but think about that. Have you ever worked for a leader who didn't trust you? And then were you able to trust that leader? Probably not. It's pretty hard to trust somebody who doesn't trust you. So how could you expect your followers to trust you if you don't trust them first? So I think leaders and it comes with some risk. Leadership is a risky business, but you've got to trust others first. The other thing you have to do, you have to provide a vision. You have to provide a purpose to your followers in order to grow trust. You've got to display integrity. You've got to be truthful. You've got to follow up on things. If you promise somebody something, you've got to deliver. You have to lead by example. That means shouldering the load, showing to people that, hey, I'm willing to roll up my sleeves and work right alongside of you. Maybe not doing the exact same task because everybody's task is a little bit different, but you're willing to shoulder the load and you have to lead by example. So if you set a standard, if the standard is everybody is here by 7:30 in the morning, you don't want to come walking in at 7:45. You want to lead by example, and then you have to show that you actually care about people, putting their welfare above your own. But you'll see this picture here. You'll see a younger me in the middle. You'll see a man to the right. His name is Governor Mamoon. He was the governor of Al Anbar province. Ramadi was the capital of Al Anbar province, and my interpreter to the left of the screen there. And again, Ramadi was the capital of Al Anbar province, so I had to engage Governor Mamoon regularly while we were in Ramadi. I usually talk to him at least once a week. And he's somebody that we wanted to protect because he was kind of on the fence. He kind of supported our activities, our U.S. military activities there, kind of, sort of, so he was on the fence a bit, but we wanted to protect him. He had to have a medical procedure conducted. And because Ramadi was so dysfunctional, we had to send him off to Baghdad, about 2 hours east of us, to an American military medical facility in Baghdad. And he was gone about 2 weeks to get this medical procedure conducted. And when he came back to Ramadi, he sent a message to my headquarters that he wanted to see me as soon as he could. I show up at his headquarters in the government center, and he had this huge room, that was his office, and he always had an entourage in there, usually about 20 sheikhs and another 10 personal staff around him. He asked everybody in his room to leave. Only 3 people left in his office was Governor Mamoon, myself, and my interpreter. And by the way, this is not a picture of the exact incident that I'm going to describe. But at any rate, he came and he sat down beside me. He took my hand in his hand, the first time he ever did that. And for anybody who knows anything about Arab culture, when an Arab man takes another man's hand in his, it's a sign of trust and respect. First time he ever did that with me. And he said, Colonel Gronski goes, many times you've sat here in my office, you've told me about American values. You've told me about the values of your soldiers and Marines. And I never really knew what you were trying to tell me. But he said, when I was at that American medical military facility in Baghdad, I watched with my own eyes a wounded insurgent being brought into the trauma clinic there. And I saw how hard your American medics and nurses and doctors struggled to save the life of that insurgent. He said, I could not believe how hard you Americans worked to save the life of one of your enemies. He said, now I know what you're finally trying to tell me about American values. And he actually ended up supporting our operation so much more after that particular incident. So character, the point of that story is, as a leader, people, your followers are going to be watching you even when you don't know they're watching you. You know, they're going to see how you treat people. They're going to see how you display integrity. They're going to see how you adhere to the organizational values or your own core values. So they'll be watching. Another story I want to tell that has to do more with a business story is I want to talk a little bit about James Burke. James Burke was the CEO of Johnson & Johnson between 1976 and 1989. And when he took over the helm of Johnson & Johnson in 1976, the first thing he did is he called an offsite meeting for about 25 of the senior executives. And he took the Johnson & Johnson credo out, which really was the values, the principles of Johnson & Johnson. And he said, this is what we're going to do. He goes, Robert Wood Johnson wrote this credo in 1943. And it was revised in 1948, but it hasn't been touched since then. So this is 1976. What we're going to do, because it's my view, this credo is nothing more than words on a paper. It should be a guiding principle. So what we're going to do is examine this credo, examine our Johnson & Johnson values, and we're either going to keep them as they are, tweak them a little bit, or discard them entirely. But when we're done, we're actually going to stand by this credo. And then over the next 3 years, he continued to meet with other executives farther on down the ladder there and getting their opinion. Finally, the revised credo, slightly revised credo, was reintroduced in 1979. Now, why do I tell this story? It's because of what happened in 1982, the Tylenol crisis. I don't know how many people remember, but in 1982, some crazy guy laced Tylenol in the Chicago area with cyanide. 9 people died in the Chicago area. And Jim Burke and his leadership team, they had to make a decision. What are they going to do? You know, is this cyanide lacing just confined to Chicago, or is it all over the country? What are we going to do as a company? So Burke made the decision, take 31 million bottles of Tylenol off the shelves throughout the United States. Anybody who had Tylenol at their home could return it for a full refund, even if it was opened. It cost Johnson & Johnson over $100 million to do this. There were business analysts before he made that decision that said, the Tylenol brand is done. We will never see the Tylenol brand again. 3 months later, after he did all that, and by the way, they invented that tamper-proof seal to put on top of the Tylenol, which a lot of companies are using now. 3 months later, Johnson & Johnson regained 80% of the market for Tylenol. Amazing. And Burke said the main reason they made that decision was because of the process they went through to revise that credo between 1976 and 1979. He said, we took so much time and energy to revise that credo, and we made a pact that we were going to stand by these values. He said, it would have ruined the company if we went against those values. And so I think that's a very interesting story, how a CEO of a large company made a $100 million decision just to stand by the values of that particular company. So with that, I'd like to just see if we have any other questions, comments, and I'd be glad to field them for you.
All right, John. Could you discuss the relationship between being an effective follower and growing as an effective leader?
Yeah, I think followership is a big thing. I think just as there's attributes that leaders need to exhibit. There's attributes that followers need to exhibit. You know, if you have a disagreement, you know, one of the attributes would be if you have a disagreement with a leader, you know, you got to be upfront and discuss it with them. You shouldn't badmouth the leader behind their back. You shouldn't badmouth the organization. If you feel that strongly about, you know, hey, this organization is screwed up, you might want to think about leaving the organization rather than badmouthing it. So I think there's certain, and you've got to help your teammates. You know, you've got to go out of your way to help your teammates. If you see a teammate struggling with something, you know, help them out a little bit, and hopefully they'll help you out when you need when you need help. But if you do those things, that's going to paint you as a person who has good character, who has good judgment, and it'll probably help you get into a leadership position someday.
Okay. All right. What was the number one life-changing lesson, John, you learned while in Ramadi?
Yeah, I think purpose. As a leader, you know, I think one of the number one leadership lessons I learned is you had to be able to craft and communicate a purpose to those that you lead. And I'll give you an example. Again, with the number of attacks we were having, you know, the number of soldiers and Marines who were killed, wounded severely, every day to an average soldier out there could kind of be like Groundhog Day. And sometimes it was hard when you're down there at the very grassroots level to understand why you were there. Why were you 7,000 miles away from your family and friends? And so the purpose I crafted that I communicated to my subordinate leaders, and then actually anytime I was out there with the soldiers, I would communicate this purpose and articulate this purpose, is the reason we're over there fighting this insurgency in Iraq is so our families, our friends, and all Americans could be safer back home. Whether that was true or not true, I don't care, but that was the purpose I believed in. That was the purpose I communicated. So the point is, you've got to communicate a purpose to your followers that is something greater than themselves, that is going to keep them getting out of bed in the morning, that is going to keep them from getting frustrated, that is going to keep them from getting discouraged. So purpose is one of the big things. And I would say a close second is the fact that a leader has to be where the action is. I did a lot of battlefield circulation there for a couple of different reasons. First of all, I don't think a leader could get a good sense of what's going on by sitting behind an office desk reading a report. A leader has to get out there and look into the eyes of their followers, look into the eyes of the workers, and see how they feel and see what they think about things. And then the other thing is it shows that you're willing to share the risk. You know, it shows that you're willing to go into a dangerous situation and share the risk along with those that you're following. Now, again, in a civilian company, it might not be a physical risk, but maybe it's an emotional risk. You know, maybe if there's a tough client that has to be dealt with, maybe instead of just sending one of your direct reports in there to deal with that client, you say to that direct report, you know what, we're both going to go in there and talk to him because I know he's angry. And I'm going to help take the brunt of that anger. And I'm just not going to let you take it. So there's different ways you could show that you're willing to share the load. That's just one example.
John, thank you for delivering a highly effective presentation. And you certainly lead by example. You've exemplified resilience and character throughout your life. And we have your contact information as displayed on your last slide. We'll ask if you will provide your PPT to us to send out to participants upon request.
Sure.
A lot of valuable information in there. Also, John, please give us the title of your book.
Yeah. The title of my book is The Ride of Our Lives, Lessons on Life, Leadership, and Love. What that book about, at its heart, it's a leadership book, but it's a book about that period in my life. That time in 1983 when my wife and I made the decision to bicycle across the United States, not motorcycles, but bicycles. And then it's stories on life, leadership, and love, lessons we learned as we made that trip across the United States. So it's, again, Ride of Our Lives, Lessons on Life, Leadership, and Love. Thank you for asking.